Well, let's start looking at this week's reading, the introduction and first two chapters from Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. Maybe start a little bit farther on. A little bit in the middle of things to get, a sense of what we're reading and what its purposes are. He says, I'm not making a case for epistemological relativism. A lot of philosophy here, a lot of philosophical terms. Maybe my job is to put them in more of a context. Some ways of truth-telling are better than others, and therefore have a healthier influence on the cultures that adopt them. Indeed, I hope to persuade you that the decline of a print-based epistemology and the accompanying rise of a television-based epistemology has had grave consequences for public life, and that we are getting sillier by the minute. Of course, we need to talk about how he's using the idea of epistemology here, which is interesting, philosophically interesting, and in its own right, and also is meant to help us understand our current, his current situation in 1985. But one of the things, just coming off of a few weeks looking at Marshall McLuhan, is that clearly we have a different sort of approach to media and their effects on us and our consciousness and public life and politics and ethics, which is much more straightforwardly critical, right? The getting sillier by the minute is certainly very emblematic of what his overall goal is here, is to kind of expose the silliness and try to trace it to its root causes. But these first two chapters are just that, the root causes. He's trying to give you a theoretical foundation for his critique of television culture, or television's effect on the culture of the United States. Just really his main focus. And I would, if you have time, I would urge you to take a look at the contemporary television interview he did, which he explains that it really is the United States, television of the United States, that he considers to be his subject, because it's the most important television because of its global influence at the time. American television was being exported all over the world at that time, and the American style of television was becoming the most popular style, and that may be something interesting to trace in itself. So we get a sense of what he's about here. His argument. Well, his argument is interesting. Again, it's a philosophical argument. It's an argument about how human beings get a worldview, how they find ways to comprehend reality, right? One of maybe the things we haven't really talked about, focused on, is that word medium. And maybe I could just do a little improvising here. That is, when you think about what is a medium, a medium is something which mediates. And it is something that is, let's just say that we are the subject. We are the knower or subject. Let's just call him the subject, philosophical term. The subject, the knower, the perceiver, the thinker. That's you and me, the conscious mind, the conscious person, individual. And presumably we are interested in knowing the world. That we're interested in, for practical and for purely for its own sake, for knowing the world, for being in touch with the world, for correctly characterizing the world. When we know something, where there's the subject side and the object side. When we perceive something. Now, we get a little into Plato here and into maybe metaphysics, but more into a certain type of metaphysics. But when we think of something. There's the thinker or subject, which is an active, conscious mind, and then there's the object, the thing thought about, the thing perceived, the thing known. Since the very beginning of Western philosophy, it's been recognized that it's not so simple. That something stands between you as the thinker or perceiver and the object in the world, which is just to say that something always mediates between you and the world, you and the thing itself, let's say. Maybe in a way, if we look beyond figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to a wider consciousness of Greek thinkers at the time, especially the people called sophists, Protagoras being the most prominent of them, they were very quick to point out that you never see the world directly. You see it through the lens of your own senses, first of all. And you understand the world through your language, through your culture, through your biology. And the world as it exists is the world that exists for you. This would lead us into relativism and all sorts of other things. But, there's nothing saying that there, in a way, maybe the search for truth is the search for the correct medium, right? But that's what a medium is, something that stands between you and the thing. When you read a news article about an event, that is the medium through which you're learning about the event, but you can't bypass that medium. When you see footage of a war going on television, the television is the medium. It's the thing through which you are getting in touch with that presumably real thing in the world. So maybe it would maybe that would help. I don't know, a very schematic, simplified way of thinking about it or portraying it. But a medium mediates, and we always see the world in some way, and see it, literally see it. I'm looking through the medium, not only my eyes, but through these glasses. It's the way the world appears to me, and it's the only way it can, pretty much, unless I want to walk into a lamppost all day. I'm sorry, where were we? Sorry. Well, let's go back to the beginning. I'm sorry. So his argument here it is an argument that fixes attention on the forms of human conversation and postulates that how we are obliged to conduct such conversations will have the strongest possible influence on what ideas we can conveniently express. And what ideas are convenient to express inevitably become the important content of a culture. McLuhan said content doesn't matter. It's the medium that matters. It's the form. The medium is the message. And the mistake that people were making was saying, well, television is either good or bad. It really depends on what's on television. And McLuhan is saying, well, wait a second. Aren't you missing the big point here? And that is that the form itself of television, the media itself, is having all sorts of effects irrespective of content. Well, it would seem to me that here, although Postman certainly is a kind of a student of McLuhan, somebody who in the 1980s was speaking highly of McLuhan, and McLuhan has really fallen into eclipse. I mean, he got so popular, so much attention, so widely read that there was a backlash to that, as there often is when intellectuals become very popular, and has really fallen into obscurity. I think that he's probably better thought of today than he was in Postman's time. I hope so. He's a really great thinker. But Postman is certainly not McLuhan, in the sense that his whole argument, he's telling us, is that form influences content. So content matters. That is, that the forms of expression, what he calls the conversations here, are going to have an effect on the content of the conversations. That some things fit into television, some things do well on television. Let's say something like advertising a product or making a person laugh. And some things don't fit well into television, like getting a nuanced grasp of foreign affairs, or understanding the world economy, or understanding human rights, or something like that. I think that sort of going that way, that is one of the things that he's saying and lamenting, as he says, is the way that television has squeezed out, because it just isn't amenable to it, not in any nefarious or conspiratorial way, but just because it's not good at those things. It's squeezed out the politics. It's squeezed out any kind of reasoning or reasoned grasp of politics. To say it then as plainly as I can, this book is an inquiry into and a lamentation about. McLuhan would never say that. McLuhan was way too cheerful to say this. This is definitely a post-McLuhan grasp of media. Lamentation about the most significant American cultural fact of the second half of the 20th century, the decline of the age of typography, and he'll have a long and very interesting history of what he calls the age of typography. Again, it's really in the American context. And the ascendancy of the age of television. This changeover has dramatically and irreversibly shifted the content. See, he's interesting. The content and meaning of public discourse, which is really his focus here, is public discourse. Arguments, inquiries, conversations, back and forth about the serious issues of the day. Since two media so vastly different cannot accommodate the same ideas. Well, that's two media would be the medium of print and the medium of television. As the influence of print wanes, the content of politics, religion, education, and anything else that comprises public business must change and be recast in terms that are suitable to television. So really what he's saying here is that television has a kind of a tyranny over the American mind at this point. That everything, all the institutions have to make their accommodations to it, and that, again, this is a disaster. That this is a complete and utter disaster for America and probably the world, that the accommodation of public discourse to the limitations of television has been an unmitigated disaster. But again, this is really based on a theoretical grounding. That is, his critique of television, his lamentation about television is based upon some theoretical grounding having to do with his idea of medium as metaphor and medium as epistemology. But here, he shows roots in McLuhan. Each medium, like language itself, makes possible a unique mode of discourse by providing a new orientation for thought, for expression, for sensibility, which of course is what McLuhan meant in saying that the medium is the message. I don't know if that completely captures McLuhan, but I don't really have any problem. I don't know, we may have different ideas. So first, metaphor. Medium as metaphor. But what is a metaphor? Which is really not such an easy question, right? It's one of those elusive things. He says, we're told in school quite correctly that a metaphor suggests what a thing is by comparing it to something else. And by the power of its suggestion, it so fixes a conception in our minds that we can't imagine the one thing without the other. Again, this is if we go back, if you don't mind, maybe we can go back. That little thing I drew. If we stick metaphor in there where medium is, I think that's kind of what he's getting at, right? That is, that we don't experience the world directly, and we certainly don't comprehend it without help. And the help can be a metaphor. That is, the clock is a big metaphor that he talks about. time is not a clock. A clock is a mechanical device. But it became the dominant metaphor of saying, well, this is time, which of course it's not. But we represent time typically. One of the ways we represent it, how else we represent it, is through an old-fashioned clock, and we understand the world through that metaphor. It's like saying that God is like a father or a wise old man. God is not a man. Okay, God is not a man. He's not a woman. But he's no more a man than he is a woman, right? It's a metaphor. If Michelangelo had painted the Sistine Chapel with a woman sticking her arm out and giving life to Adam, that would have been just as truthful, right? I mean, the idea that God is a man with a gray beard, it's not silly. It's a wonderful image, but it's completely arbitrary. It's a metaphor, and the dominant metaphors are important. This is what the whole thing is about. The idea is that television presents us with certain metaphors, I suppose, that mediate between us and the world, that influence us. I don't know. One of the things he points out in the beginning is his dismay that an old Hollywood actor was president of the United States, Ronald Reagan, in the 1980s. And clearly, people watching Hollywood movies all their lives, they were given a certain idea of what a president was supposed to be like. And they are portrayed in movies. Well, Ronald Reagan fit the bill. I mean, today, the president of the United States is essentially a reality TV actor. And that's kind of interesting, Could Trump have become president if he didn't have a popular TV show where he acted like he knew what he was doing and showed all the virtues of a leader and could make tough decisions? I mean, it's all made up. There's nothing real about reality television. It was all nonsense, but it was certainly an image that must have stuck in some people's mind to think that a guy who that's what a president is supposed to be. Whatever. Suppose I have maybe a clearer conception of why he uses the word epistemology rather than metaphor. Here's this idea: epistemology is a Greek word. It means the study of knowledge. How do we know anything? Under what conditions can we be said to know something? Epistemology is this theory of knowledge. Let's say if you're a skeptic, you don't think that knowledge is possible. That would be your take on it. If you're a realist, it would mean that you do think that we have the ability to grasp the world as it is. Most people, I think, fall somewhere in between. But this is what he says about it. Whatever the original and limited context of its use may have been, a medium has the power to fly far beyond that context into new and unexpected ones because of the way it directs us to organize our minds and integrate our experience of the world. It imposes itself on our consciousness and social institutions in myriad forms. It sometimes has the power to become implicated in our concepts of piety or goodness or beauty. And it is always implicated in the way we define and regulate our ideas of truth. Now, that's what I wanted to get to. He's connecting up. He's saying epistemology is basically define truth. That they tell us how to get it. They tell us under what conditions we can be confident that something is true. And he talks a lot about or he suggests the transition from an oral to a print culture where truth was gotten through speech to a stage where truth can only be gotten through writing, especially through print. So the importance of epistemology is that they set up standards of reality, the conditions under which something can be thought of as being reliably true. That would be what he's calling an epistemology. Suppose he's going to be, kind of saying it's not really real unless it's on TV, right? So in any case, like the media that we have become our epistemologies because they become the dominant forms of finding or presenting truth. If something was in a newspaper and was printed and distributed around the city in the old days, that gave it the imprimatur of truth. If something was on television, today I have no idea. We live in a much more complex thing. We can talk about that perhaps later. Epistemology is okay. Yes. Okay, here we go. I want to show that definitions of truth are derived, at least in part, from the character of the media of communication through which information is conveyed. I want to discuss how media are implicated in our epistemology. It's very interesting, as he goes through this, talking about the culture of typography, the way that people's sense of reality is shaped by their media, and especially whatever the dominant medium is. He finally says this, yes, right, okay, we saw this already, but he says he's not a relativist, which is interesting because I think he is, but maybe it's hard to be a relativist and also be a criticizer of something. And if he's taking television culture to task and saying it's bad, well, he has to be standing for something that's good, right? So this is a pretty complex philosophical question. He's not a philosopher. I don't know what he taught. He's a brilliant man. It's a great book, but he's not a trained philosopher. He's very well read, obviously, and really I think it's a brilliant book, but there are some philosophical questions that he raises which aren't exactly resolved. But in any case, it's important that he says that he's not a relativist, because he does want to say some ways of truth-telling are better than others. And clearly he's going to say that the effects on human beings of living in a print culture encourage them to be more thoughtful, more rational, more skeptical, more able to engage in critical thinking than the dominant epistemology or dominant medium of television. Now, of course, it's always a philosophical question there about how you justify one thing as being better or lower standard. But not being a philosopher, maybe he's allowed to put that aside a little bit more easily. But not a relativist. I think McLuhan was. I think he was a relativist. I think, I was obviously in those videos for McLuhan struggling in trying to articulate what McLuhan's politics were, and I surely failed because I don't think that it was clear. But at the end of the day, I think McLuhan was a relativist. He didn't think that you really could privilege any form of society, any form of media as being better than others. The point I am leading to, it's always good when an author says that, right? The point I am leading to by this and the previous examples is the concept of truth is intimately linked to the biases of forms of expression. That idea of bias, of media bias, not like the people who control the media are biased. The medium itself has a bias. It is inherently more conducive to portraying some things than portraying others. Truth does not and never has come unadorned. He's not a realist in the sense that he thinks we can just simply grasp reality. Truth is always truth through some medium. It must appear in its proper clothing or it is not acknowledged, which is a way of saying that the truth is a kind of cultural prejudice. That sounds like a relativist to me. I mean, I'm not saying it's bad, but he's saying he's not a cultural relativist. Each culture conceives of it as being most authentically expressed in certain symbolic forms. So extremely interesting. Philosophically, it's basically a form of a kind of a cultural relativism, or at least historicism, in the sort of Hegelian, Margolian, Marxist sort of general way in which we realize that our grasp of truth and reality is going to be a function of our place in history, our culture, which doesn't mean necessarily we can't transcend those limits, at least sometimes. So, but clearly Postman, like McLuhan, is sort of in that tradition.